What do you think the single most important quality is in a WTO Director General? What does the World Trade Organization need now?
I think the most important trait that a Director General can bring to the membership is the ability to catalyze things. It's the ability to figure out solutions even when members are having opposite views about any particular issue. This is particularly important with the kind of environment that we live today, a very polarized world, not only in terms of trade and economics, but geopolitics as well. So being able to bring opposite sides to the table, finding commonalities, making things move, I think that's the most difficult challenge for a Director General at this point. In an organization that is driven by the members, so the Director General and the organization itself cannot create rules, cannot create any kind of outcome without unanimity of all members, all 164.
We have a time where we're seeing a lot of change in terms of gender equality, and I believe all of the former leaders since its inception of the WTO have been men. Do you think it's time to see a woman put in charge?
It would definitely be a welcome development. I don't think gender can be or should be the only parameter guiding the succession, but I think it's absolutely natural that an organization that has been there since 1995, never being led by a woman, that this time around a woman would be taking the head of the organization. There are 8 candidates now, all of them very high profile, all of them extremely qualified, with 3 women right there who are also very qualified. And I'm sure that members are going to find the right person for the job.
Good morning to you, Roberto. Let me ask you about the US electoral process. Do you think that a victory for Joe Biden would change the trajectory of the WTO? Clearly, the Trump administration has not had the same worldview as the WTO. Would a President Biden make a big difference?
It's a bit speculative because I haven't seen or heard much in the campaign about the WTO, particularly on the side of the Biden camp. So I don't know exactly what plans they have for the organization, but clearly some changes may come, particularly in terms of nuance, particularly in terms of strategy, tactics, how to approach the issues that are before the organization. But having said all that, a lot of what's happening in the WTO has to do with the headwinds of geopolitics. Particularly in some axes, like the U.S.-China axis, and the antagonistic nature of this relationship to some extent. And those tensions are not going to disappear. They're not going to change. So I don't know how much of a change we can expect, but it's definitely possible that something different will come up.
And on that subject, is President Trump right, to some extent, that it was wrong to allow China to enter the WTO, or at least that it was allowed in on the wrong terms?
I think the President Trump administration has been pretty consistent throughout about their views of the organization. I think the most obvious complaint that they have put forward is the need for reform. It's the need for the organization to change. It's not a necessarily an existential issue, but it is certainly something that has to do with the need for international organizations, the WTO included, to adapt, to change, to reflect a little bit more the reality of the 21st century. The organization has not truly evolved since it was created in 1995, and the world is very, very different now. So I would say this kind of demand for significant changes will be there. But mind you, changes in the WTO require everyone to agree. So this is not going to be an easy task, not for the members, not for the next Director General either.
Well, can I ask then, in your view, has China been a model member of the WTO in terms of fair trade, in terms of intellectual property rights? Is China doing what it needs to do?
China has been, participating in the WTO like every other member. Whether or not what they do, their practices are in full compliance of their commitments, this is something that only the members can ascertain. It's important that people understand that the WTO is not a police. We cannot blow the whistle and say, you're doing this right, you're doing this wrong. We don't do that, and we don't assess what members do. Members assess themselves. It's a kind of a peer monitoring continuously. They call each other out if they think somebody else is doing something wrong. If there is no agreement on how to fix that situation, then there is dispute settlement. It's an arbitration in the WTO. So I cannot pass judgment on who is doing right and who is doing wrong. But clearly, a lot of members, and China included, have been at odds on how their practices would or would not comply with their obligations in the WTO.
Director General, I'm speaking from here in London, and I wonder, looking at the Brexit preparedness, what do you think that the UK government should be doing at this point to prepare for the possibility of operating on WTO rules in its big relationship across the Channel?
It's a big change. I think there is no doubt about that, both in terms of the terms of the relationship, assuming that there is no agreement. I suppose that's the presumption of the question. Assuming there is no agreement, it will be a tall order to adapt so quickly, both in terms of substance of the relationship, the terms of the relationship themselves, but also in terms of institutional structure. It's pretty hard to set up a whole system to control, monitor all the border crossing procedures, both for goods and services. It's going to be tricky, but it's not a disaster. And most of the WTO members deal with each other with the commitments they have undertaken in the WTO. And that's mostly, I suppose you're talking about market access things like tariffs, quotas, things like that. But some preferential access to each other markets will be lost. And the thickness of that wall will depend on the sector. It will depend, for example, on how high the tariffs that apply for a particular product would be once the zero tariff is lost. That is something that will vary significantly from sector to sector.